my dears, welcome to another Disability Dramaturgy Deep Dive. I am so glad to have you. Today we're going to talk about Kimberly Akimbo. I know that I made a video about the show like 2 years ago maybe, but it was not up to my academic standards. So we are back. It's going to be better. I look like the ghost of elementary school Sydney's past, so get excited, it's gonna be great. Brief housekeeping things real quick before we get into it. Hi, hello! Welcome to the series where we break down disability in theater to academically demonstrate that disabled stories have always been a part of the media canon and always will be. We work on those critical thinking media analysis skills, and we talk about ways to more ethically stage and talk about these shows, always with a cool, that happened. Now what? Mindset that lovingly pushes the industry forward and unpacks the fundamentally flawed system on which it was built. I'm not about pointing fingers, I'm about acknowledging the system that creates art such as this. If you like the series or anything else on this channel, I have a Patreon that is linked below. You're welcome to join if you so desire. It's how I'm able to continue making these videos, but also absolutely no pressure. And you're welcome to like, subscribe, leave a comment, do whatever sparks joy if you want to support me in that way, which is free. I will of course link the playlist of all of my other disability theater deep dive videos below for you as well, and also my source document if you want to check that out. And for friends who need it, I am a white young person with light brown shoulder length curly hair that is pulled back in butterfly clips, which are a pain in the butt to use. I haven't used them since elementary school and I'm remembering why. It's kind of all over the place and crazy, but I've given up trying. And I'm wearing a navy blue and white striped shirt that is the only striped piece of clothing I own for some reason, with a black tank top on top of it. It's not my best cosplay, okay? I can admit that, but at least I tried. And I'm sitting in front of a plain wall that has green leaves on it. Amazing! So, if you know nothing about this show, it is about a 16-year-old girl named Kimberly who has a rare disease that makes her age at 4.5 times the rate of the average person and is almost at the end of her life expectancy. We will go over the plot a lot more thoroughly in just a hot second, but I think that is enough to get us started for the history section. So, Kimberly Akimbo began its life as a play written by David Lindsay-Abaire in 2000, which premiered in 2001 at South Coast Repertory and then was off-Broadway at the Manhattan Theater Club at New York City Center Stage 1 in 2003. Lindsay-Abaire teamed up with composer Jeanine Tesori, who they'd previously worked on Shrek the Musical together, to turn Akimbo into a musical that premiered off-Broadway at the Atlantic's Linda Gross Theater at the end of 2021, directed by Jessica Stone, and that show then transferred to Broadway at the Booth Theater in the fall of 2022, which ran until last spring with 612 performances and 32 previews. It won the Tony Awards for Best Musical, Best Book, Best Score, Best Leading Actress for Victoria Clark, and Best Supporting Actress for Bonnie Milligan. The national tour launched in September of 2024, and it's currently running around the country with Carolee Carmello as Kimberly Lovago. At this point, I will give you a spoiler warning for the rest of the video. It's kind of hard to assess narrative in depth without spoiling most of what happens, so continue watching at your own risk. Anyway, our show begins with Kimberly Lovago, an almost 16-year-old girl who looks like she's in her 70s, though she is always played by somebody in their early 60s, in ice skates, seemingly searching for someone and nervously chewing on her candy necklace. She takes off her skates and she goes to return them, and at the same time we meet the other high schoolers, Delia, Erin, Teresa, and Martin, who are caught in what I think I can best describe as a love rectangle, because everybody has a huge crush on somebody else. But anyway, the four of them sing about how it's Saturday night in Skater Planet in Bergen County, New Jersey, and how functionally everything is boring and uninteresting, and they want nothing more than to be cool, or be invited to a party, or have their love requited, or just be seen. We also meet Seth, who is one of their classmates who works at Skater Planet and generally feels the same as all the others. Kimberly sings about how it's hard being the new girl, and what it's like to be stared at but nobody really sees her, and all of them just feel weird and awkward and uncomfortable and like they don't fit in. We then transition to seeing Kimberly sitting freezing in the snow on a bench late at night, still waiting. Finally, her dad, Buddy, appears, not even realizing that he's there to pick her up 2.5 hours after the rink closed, which is 3.5 hours after he said that he would be there to pick her up. He tells her happily that he won a Game Boy in a bet that night and he's hoping that they can share it. She asks him if he's okay to drive because she knows where he has been, and she gives him coffee that she had put in her thermos for him to sober up a little bit, and he tells her to lie about car troubles when her mother asks why they're home late, saying that if she does lie, he will take her to Six Flags, and she points out that he's been promising this for years and it's never happened, so she's not going to suddenly believe him this time. Seth, back at the rink to pick up his tuba, asks her if she has a partner for the biology presentation yet and what disease she's thinking of doing, and he offers that maybe they could work together and they could do the presentation on her disease. And both she and her dad kind of freeze up and they halfway decline and then they head out. In the meantime, we see Kimberly's mother, Patty, who's very pregnant and both of her arms are in giant bandages, and she sets up a video camera to record to make a video diary for her baby. She sings about how she had double carpal tunnel surgery, which is why her hands are in bandages, and also there's a high probability that she's going to be dead soon, so she won't be around when the baby's growing up, and that's actually why she's making these video diaries so that her daughter can know her and defend her honor against whatever other people might say about her. Then Kimberly and her dad enter, and Patty asks where they've been. Kim asks where the video camera came from, and Patty says she borrowed it it from the neighbors, and Buddy completely panics and reminds everybody that nobody can know that they just moved from Lodi because something to do with Aunt Deborah that Kim does not want to know for plausible deniability reasons. And then Kimberly goes to get cereal that she feeds to her mother while Buddy plays on the new Game Boy. They talk about the camera and how she's making a video diary for the baby in case she dies, and then the parents get into a spat and Kimberly reminds them of the swear jar and suggests that they should use the swear jar money to fund a family road trip, at which point Patty goes back to asking about why they were late and points out that Buddy smells like a bar room. Kimberly in her bedroom works on writing a letter to the Make-A-Wish Foundation about what her 3 wishes are for them to pick one to grant. She dreams of being beautiful for a day, of traveling the world, or of having a cool pet, and then of having a simple home-cooked meal and a normal family dinner with a family that doesn't fight and remembers to ask her how her day was. But she erases the last thing and she asks for a tree house, even though they don't have a tree. And that is a joke that happens in Act 2. At school, we see the 4 students talking about what disease they're going to do for biology class and then about show choir. Seth appears and he says hello to Kim in Elvish because he's a nerd and tries again to find a bio partner, and Kim offers to work with him, so they agree to meet up in the library during last period. In the library, the 4 are playing Uno while Kim and Seth sit together to work on the assignment, and he asks her some questions about her disease. She answers them. We learn that the average life expectancy for this disease is 16 years, and then he offers to do an anagram of her name because he's really into the puzzleistic arts and wants to make one for her. And while he works through it, she sings about how she likes how he thinks and that he looks at the world differently, and most importantly, she likes him. And he comes up with the anagram, Cleverly Akimbo. Then a disheveled-looking lady appears with a garbage bag full of her belongings, thrilled to see Kimberly. This is Aunt Deborah. She's been living in this library for 10 days waiting for Kimberly to show up because the family moved away without her and she wanted to track them down. She pressures Kimberly into giving her the new address and leaving the door unlocked to let her in, and tells her that she needs Kim's help with a plan that she has and that she also is going to need a crew. And Kimberly's like, I don't want anything to do with that, but there's only so much that you can try to do to dissuade her because Deborah is very convincing. Deborah then approaches the show choir kids to ask them if they want to be a part of her money-making scheme, and then sings a song about how, like, yeah, crime's wrong, but also you need to grab life by the horns and make your life better, including lots of examples as to how she has scammed, defrauded, and committed crimes against vulnerable people. Later that night, Kimberly goes downstairs to unlock the door for Deborah and runs into her mother, who is still awake, and they have this talk where Kimberly decides that the baby should be named Carmelita, and then Deborah appears through the window with a giant can of chemicals, as one does, and then Buddy shows up incredibly intoxicated with a pair of passes for Six Flags that he'd won in a bar bet and is proud to show off, but it turns out that they're expired. At which point he notices Deborah and he gets very upset that she found them and says, "You owe me a stereo." And Buddy tries to convince Patty to kick Deborah out, but it doesn't work. Kimberly takes him off to bed and Deborah enters dragging a giant USPS mailbox. After everybody goes to bed, we learn that the adults are all trying not to think about the fact that now that it's past midnight, it is Kimberly's 16th birthday. Patty sings a song called Father Time, a song she used to sing to Kim when she was a child, asking Father Time to give them more of it. And the next morning, Buddy drives Kim and Seth to school. At first, it's just a little awkward, but it turns into Buddy spiraling about the fact that his daughter likes a boy, and he ends up flipping out at them and yelling that Seth is never going to get into Kimberly's pants, and then Kimberly yells at him about how much she hates him and wishes that he were dead, and also he forgot to wish her a happy birthday. At school, we see the show choir kids being friendly with Kim, and things seem genuinely good and like she has friends, though obviously she's very nervous around Seth after that whole outburst. But they talk, and he mentions that his home life is wonky too, with his brother in rehab and his dad constantly distracted or focused on the brother after Seth's mother died. And he says that, you know, her dad was being all protective and stuff, but also like she should be allowed to do whatever she wants to do. And if she ever wants to be kissed or anything, he would totally do it as a friend. And if she ever wants to, she should just let him know. And she agrees that she'll let him know, and it's really awkward and it's really cute. And then she sings a little reprise of the anagram song from earlier. Later that night, everybody is at the skating rink. We learn that there is no money in the budget for the show choir costumes, and they're afraid that without them they won't win states. So Deborah talks them into joining her scheme. Meanwhile, Seth gives Kimberly a book of anagrams for her birthday, and her parents arrive with a really smushed cake because Seth had invited them, and Deborah gives her a giant pine cone wrapped in what I think is toilet paper? Unclear. Buddy promises that he is going to quit drinking as her birthday gift. Patty promises that she's going to be a better mom. They talk about the potential family road trip, and Kimberly agrees to Deborah's plan, and they sing that maybe this is the time that things are going to work out. And then they all ice skate, which at least on Broadway was real ice skates on the stage, and it was super cool. And then she blows out her birthday candles, and it's intermission. After intermission, Deborah and all the kids are in the basement, and Deborah teaches them how to wash a check so that they can commit fraud, using Kimberly dressed up as an old grandma going with Seth to deposit his birthday checks at the bank to make money to pay for the road trip and the show choir costumes and Deborah's trip to Hawaii. I still don't know how they were ever going to get enough money from one instance of check fraud to cover all of that without being at all suspicious, but suspension of disbelief or whatever. Seth then sings a song about how he's always been the good kid to a point where it makes him invisible in comparison to his brother, and is wondering if now doing the wrong thing, i.e. participating in bank fraud, is the right choice. It also involves a sad tuba solo, which I think has to be my personal highlight of the show. It's incredible. In the living room, we see Patty, now also wearing a leg brace after falling on the ice while ice skating, and Buddy, who is just in from a run that he sort of regrets going on, and they're both trying like new things to be good parents and struggling immensely with them, but like points to them for trying. And after Patty leaves, he picks up the camera and he records himself saying that he never really saw himself being a parent. He saw a future of all kinds of interesting things, but then in high school, Patty got pregnant and he decided to do the right thing, and there's no shame in just being a regular person, but also like see the world while you can and take your time with life because there's no rush. Back at school, all the kids are hanging out together and having a great time, but then they start singing about how they can't wait to grow up and to get out of this town and have a long and exciting future ahead of them, and Kim starts to get uncomfortable and dissociate a little bit. And then we're in bio class, where each group presents their diseases. And when Kimberly and Seth go up, he reads off the cards, and she begins to panic about how she's being looked at like a statistic or a freak on display, and gets angry that their disease is adolescence that will be cured by getting older. Meanwhile, getting older is her disease that has no cure. With sort of undertone of, you don't understand how lucky you are to have your worries be friends and football games and acne, well, I'm just worried about how I'm gonna die soon. And then she walks off. That night, Kimberly comes home to see that her family has set the table to have a nice home-cooked dinner for her, and she's incredibly surprised and a little wary about what to do with that. But they all sit down for a meal and they ask her about her day, and everybody feels pretty uneasy about how normal they're all trying to be because everybody expects that something's going to happen to make this boil over. And then it does, with Buddy and Deborah getting in a huge fight over the stereo that he says that she owes him, and she says, no, you promised to give me that stereo if I went around to slap your neighbor, and that's what I did. And he's like, no, the neighbor died of shock before you could slap him around the moment you crawled through the window, so you actually didn't do what I hired you to do. And then Kim realizes that this is why they left Lodi and they moved here, because objectively, Deborah had halfway murdered a guy, and then it comes out that Patty had an affair with that neighbor in order to make sure that she could have another child who wouldn't be born like Kimberly, and while they're all yelling, Kim has a heart attack and she gets rushed to the hospital. In the hospital, Seth sits with Kimberly and they talk. He says that he was thinking of going to the bank to cash the checks himself so that everybody can get what they need, even though Kim isn't able to do that anymore since she's in the hospital. And she gets really sad that they're doing it without her, but he says they're doing it for her so she can go on her road trip when she's out of the hospital. And she acknowledges, like, I don't know if I'm ever going to be out of the hospital. And he sings about how he knows that she's going to go away soon, but he would rather focus on what they can do together now and enjoy their time while they have it. So she decides to break out of the hospital and go commit check fraud anyway. Deborah goes over the game plan with all the kids. We then see Kimberly dressed as an old woman. Everybody's kind of horrified. Kimberly doesn't want to get more people involved than necessary, so she and Seth decide to do it alone and leave the rest of the kids behind. And back at the house, Buddy and Patty are putting together the crib. They've taken apart Kim's entire room to turn it into the nursery for the baby. So when Kim returns home with a duffel bag full of cash, excited about going on a family road trip now that she has the money for it, they're all genuinely shocked that she even came home from the hospital. And then she discovers her bed is gone and that her dad's drinking a beer, and she angrily packs up all of her things while she yells at them about how stupid she feels about hoping that they might be capable of changing, and that she can't wait to do things anymore because she's not dead yet and it's time that they all start acting like that. And then she leaves. The final scene takes place in a car as Seth and Kimberly drive through the Six Flags Wild Safari together, and they film a tape for her little sister. Kimberly makes Seth promise that the baby will get the tapes when she's old enough, and then they kiss, and then they sing about how they're going on a great adventure and they don't know where it's going to lead, but they're just going to enjoy the ride because nobody gets a second time around. And while this is happening, we see the parents holding their new baby and the show choir in their fancy new costumes while projections play of the various adventures Seth and Kimberly go on together, with the final frame being her smiling at Disney in Mickey Mouse ears. And that's our show. Now, I fear this video is going to end up leaning primarily toward the negative with this show in regards to disability, because there is a lot to talk about and critique, so I do want to start with some of the positives to try to frame it a little bit better. I will also note that much of the section is more or less a meta-analysis of all of the reviews and Reddit threads and show score comments I was able to track down and read. I spent about 6 hours doing that. It is not necessarily entirely my opinion. I wanted to grab things from everywhere as much as I possibly could. There's not a lot of academic text on this show yet, so I was trying to go with community conversation as my primary source here. Now, the first positive that I read over and over, obviously, is how cozy and heartwarming the show is. We love quirky little weird musicals, and I think this show, particularly with its timing directly post-COVID, really, I mean, not post-COVID, COVID's not over, but directly like post-lockdown, really felt like a little show that could for the theater community, and I've always loved that energy about it. I love supporting new musicals. I mean, it's not like a directly new musical because it's based on a play, but still, we love supporting new pieces that are coming to Broadway, and I think that's really great. A lot of people also really resonate with the themes around the fragility of life, as well as a show that's primarily a comedy but has moments that help you work through grief. I think the timing that this was off Broadway and then on Broadway was absolutely perfect given the political climate at the time, particularly because post-lockdown a lot of people felt a bit lost or stuck, and the idea of grabbing life by the horns is kind of the message that was needed a bit, as was, you know, lighter stories that have some catharsis aspects to it. I also saw some commentary about how we rarely get to see a reflection of low middle class America in theater or in media in general, and how much that meant to people to be able to see that, particularly the aspects of these characters trying to make things better for themselves despite knowing that they don't have the resources to be able to do that. Other people saw themselves represented in being the parentified child of emotionally immature parents. I saw a lot of comments about how amazing it was to have all of these weird, off-the-beaten-path characters at the center of something rather than being relegated to the quirky comedic sidekick position like they usually are in media. There were a few aspects of the disabled experience that I also definitely saw myself represented in, though at least for me that felt more frustrating than it did healing, but I know some other disabled folks did still find that to be nice to see for them. I also loved seeing a disabled girl be genuinely desired by someone, and for that someone to very clearly have big feelings about the fact that she has a disability and she has a short life expectancy, but never once put that stress onto her. He handles it himself, and I just thought that was really mature and really cool to see. There are certain things that I felt didn't quite work in this show, the main thing being that it sort of feels like two different shows smushed together into one. Like there's just simply so much going on that doesn't really intermingle super fluidly. I am all for a deeply complicated show. I'm all for a deeply chaotic show, but I felt like on one side we had, you know, a bank heist black comedy, and on the other side we had a tragedy about somebody trying to find themselves before they die young, with a lot of quick tonal whiplash in between. And to some degree, I think that whiplash was deliberate to bring some levity into what could have been a very sad show, but it felt less like moments of levity interspersed throughout and more like a sharp left turn that was very tonally inconsistent. For a show that I feel balanced that a lot better, Waitress is a great example of that. I felt this was trying to follow that sort of structure, but I don't think it was as successful in doing so. Many people also commented on the sharp shifts in tone, feeling a little emotionally manipulative or forced or heavy-handed, which I don't necessarily disagree with. A lot of it was very surface level to begin with, so I think that mixed with the pacing and the storyline caused this perception from the outside. And the plot itself also requires a really massive amount of suspension of disbelief in some directions, but then expects very firm groundedness in other directions that also felt a bit uneven and unclear and makes it hard to know where the show stands in general. And several reviewers commented on the fact that all the characters in the show are fundamentally just archetypes without distinct personalities, which makes it hard to really connect with any of them. And I think knowing the history of this show, that's mostly an issue with taking what was an archetype-centered comedic play and trying to turn that into a musical without expanding on the characters more than anything. It's not like they wrote them from scratch and this was how they wrote them. That's a carryover situation. Some reviewers also noted the lack of catharsis and closure at the end. We're like, yeah, she gets to go to Six Flags and go on her adventure, but we know at some point that she just has to go back to the terrible place and stay there until she dies sometime soon. And that can be the case, and the focus can be on enjoying the moment while you're in it, even knowing that terrible things are coming after. I'm not inherently against like a slice of life show that has sort of final beat, but you're not sure what directions things might go in afterward. But the final number of the show felt a bit like it thought it was giving you closure on everything when it just fundamentally wasn't, which was definitely not my favorite. I read a lot of reviews, even positive ones, that mentioned that the final song was trite or treacly or saccharine or oddly manipulative, or a lot of the words that kept popping up. The other main critique that I read several times over compared the show to Dear Evan Hansen, in how in the moment you feel a lot of things and it feels really great, but then afterwards you think about how not much actually genuinely changes from the beginning of the show to the end of it, and also nobody really faces any consequences for their behavior. And in this case, we have like two incredibly abusive parents and a terrible aunt who grooms a bunch of children into committing check fraud. So like, maybe some consequences should be had, or at the very least we should see these characters genuinely change by the end of it, which I don't think that we ever really get. Now normally this would be the bit of the video where we would talk about the original play, and also I found a movie that is a very similar premise and plot that I want to talk about, but we're going to go through the disability narratives first because I think that makes a bit more sense pedagogically, at least based on how I was looking at these pieces. I could be totally wrong on that, but it's totally fine, don't worry about it. So the first and most obvious disability issue in the show is I would argue the primary narrative reason that the disability is there in the first place, which is a metaphor to inspire the audience. Kimberly is a very literal representation of children with emotionally immature parents being forced to step up and act like the adult and age beyond their parents in a way that makes it near impossible for them to actually be children. They also do a thing in the opening song where they sort of equate her not fitting in and being stared at but not being really seen with the way that the rest of the teens feel, sort of using her visual difference to make a point about how everybody else feels at that age that felt a little bit like an oversimplification. But the story overall functions as your traditional inspiration corn. I don't want to get demonetized, so we're just going to keep saying corn. Your traditional inspiration corn narrative that says, wow, this poor disabled person's living a really hard life and how tragic that is, but also how grateful I am to not be in that position and just to be able to learn a lesson from it. Which is an issue because it automatically dehumanizes the disabled person at the center of it, turning them into more of a symbol or a lesson than a human being. It also implies that disabled lives are worse than non-disabled lives and are inherently negative experiences, as well as implying that disabled people are valuable for the purposes of overcoming and teaching the non-disabled a lesson about what it means to be human rather than just being valuable because we're people and people are valuable. Some examples of inspiration corn language is the only disability in life is a bad attitude, or when somebody finds out you're disabled and then compliments you for being brave and just living your daily life. Sometimes I'll be stimming in public and I will have somebody be like, wow, you're so brave. And I'm like, okay, I'm just overwhelmed. Like, chill, what are you talking about? One of the lines in the musical that specifically points to this language is, with a change of perspective, nothing's defective, which I felt really reflects this mindset. In nearly every interview that I watched with folks involved in the show, as well as reviewers talking about it, the emphasis was continuously on how the show speaks to how fragile and precious life is and what choices we make with the time that we have left, using Kimberly and her shortened life expectancy as the metaphor to demonstrate that. The show intertwines the idea of disability must exist in media to represent something, not just because disabled people exist, and disabled lives are inspiring in a way that, based on the use of saccharine and treacly and cloying and many of the even positive reviews, seems to have made a lot of audience members genuinely uncomfortable. Other critiques of the show have noted that it feels a bit like poverty corn and trauma corn, sort of for the same reasons, and that it focuses so much on how terrible her life is, and yet she's able to look on the bright side anyway, and how nice it is that things aren't like that for us, and how lucky we are. There's also a disability trope primarily utilized narratively using young autistic narrators, where the overly wise, grown-up, almost saintly disabled child narrates the grief and dysfunction around them to make understandings of a tough situation like that feel a bit more softened and removed from the reality of it. And I don't think that's entirely the case with the show and story in general, but it does have a lot of echoes of that at various points. For me, as a member of the disabled community, the idea of like death and shortened life expectancy kind of hits us in a different and more personal way than it does for many other people, because it is a lot closer to home, whether that's for ourselves or for our peers or both. And while everybody around me leaving the theater was talking about how inspired they were to go grab life by the horns and do what they want with the limited time that they have left, I just felt stressed and also a little bit commodified, if that makes sense. I saw the show like right after it opened. I was on a trip to the city working on some disability theater stuff where I had like just been in a meeting where we were talking extensively about how little representation we have and had in theater and all the work we wanted to do to try to change that. And then I go see this show that's functionally about us without us, and I left feeling immensely frustrated. Like, I know life is fleeting. I know I have to do everything that I can to not let things pass me by and make the things happen that I want to happen as soon as possible, but I felt like they're not happening fast enough. And this show was sort of telling me that like people like me only matter if I can do things that are inspiring to others, which created a level of urgency that just made me very anxious. To make this analysis, I rewatched the show to see what I would think of it through a more scholarly lens, since I obviously have learned a lot since the beginning of 2023, and I also like look at the world a lot differently. And I found that I felt a lot less targeted and anxious by the end of it, now that I have better skills at like detaching myself from narrative from a media literacy perspective, and I also have a lot more experience just watching blatant ableism, but I still found myself quite frustrated with the piece. There's also the fictional disease of it all, most notably that despite how often it is called a fictional disease, it's not a fantastical made up one. It is, to put generously, inspired by one that exists. To put it less generously, it's taking a condition that exists and making it conventionally palatable. But this like fantastical disease idea of aging differently is something that has popped up in literature and other media for most of the time that literature has existed. So I'm going to assume it's more based on that than anything else. In general, progeria is not something people tend to know much about, if they know about it at all, so I don't think there's a universe where somebody like read about it in the newspaper and then went, I will write a piece of work that is adjacently but not quite this concept. You know, like that's not a thing that probably statistically happened. It could have. But statistically, I'm going to benefit of the doubt say that it didn't. Progeria, also known as Hutchinson-Gilford progeria syndrome, named after the two doctors who separately first described it in 1886 and 1887, is a rare disease that impacts about 1 in 4 to 8 million newborns, with an estimated 400 children living with it currently worldwide. If I understand correctly, it's caused by a mutation of the lamin A gene, which is in charge of giving instructions to the body as to how to create the protein lamin A, which is in charge of holding the nuclei of our cells together. The mutated lamin A protein is called progerin, and it makes the cells unstable, so they deteriorate faster, causing people with progeria to, based on symptoms, age at about 8 to 10 times the typical speed. This gene was isolated in 2003, 4 years after the Progeria Research Foundation was created. The average age of death is 14 and a half, but there is a medication that had its first clinical drug trial in 2012, and in 2020 was approved by the FDA, called lonafarnib, that found significant improvements and can expand the life expectancy by an average of 4.5 years. There's also some conversation around the possibility of gene editing, but this is nowhere near clinical trials at this time. The science behind all of this stuff is actually very interesting. It's on the Progeria Research Foundation website if you want to check it out. Death usually occurs due to atherosclerosis, cardiac disease, and or stroke, with cardiac issues usually appearing around or by puberty. The longest living survivor of progeria was Sammy Basso, who was an Italian biologist, researcher, and activist doing extensive work on and about his disease. He passed away in October of 2024 at the age of 28, and he was really super cool. Progeria usually appears in the first year of life, with the first signs often being bulging skin in the abdominal and or thigh region, stunted growth, hair loss, and later they may develop wrinkled skin, scleroderma, eyesight loss, and musculoskeletal degeneration, which can cause stiff joints and hip dislocations. Their average height is just under 50 inches, and average weight is about 55 pounds, and other kinds of development like motor, mental, and reproductive development happen at the typical speed. They are not slowed or accelerated. In fact, I found a case, at least one case, of a mother with progeria having a healthy baby, which I thought was really cool. I looked into parenting guides for children with progeria because I was wondering about the daily life aspects to see how that could have transferred over to the show, and I was really impressed by a lot of the resources that I found. I read a lot of parenting resources for developmental disability for my job, and even when they try to be not deficit oriented, they end up being deficit oriented, and I was really surprised by how focused on presuming competence and ability and letting your kid be a kid these resources were. They talked about different ways that kids can safely play, how to accommodate the fact that clothes are never going to fit them super properly, how to give them free rein while also acknowledging that they're going to tire very easily and keep them safe. And overall, most of what I read was fairly positive, which I just found really cool given how rampant ableism tends to be in other resources for other developmental things. Kimberly's disease borrows a lot of things from progeria and how it manifests, particularly the general life expectancy and the entire list of symptoms. The Punnett square explanation that she gives Seth is a bit simplified and not entirely how that would work with this, but this show takes place the year before the Progeria Research Foundation was created and 4 years before the lamin A protein was isolated, so they probably would not know any of that to begin with, and it's also not directly progeria, but I would imagine that the PRF would cover her disease as well since it's as close to the information as anybody else would have. Like, if I were to organize it, I would say that this is one of the atypical forms of progeria rather than saying it's something else altogether, and the PRF does cover atypical progeria. The play leans into this connection a little more with the Seth character saying, "So your disease is like progeria without the dwarfism, the beaked nose, and the receded chin." And I think it's really interesting that this line did not carry over into the musical because many of the jokes that didn't age well did not get carried over into the new script, but I would consider this particular line to be very important, so I'm not sure why it wasn't included, but it seems based on all the discussions I read around the show that people are utilizing the, well, it's not a real disease to say that therefore this isn't a disability story, and that people criticizing it as such are misguided because the disease isn't real. And I've said this about other shows, but if you have to explain why, based on a technicality, something is not a disability, it is disability adjacent enough that you are responsible for handling that narrative properly and getting disabled folks involved. So I find that argument to be particularly frustrating. Also because it's not like progeria isn't heavily connected to and with this show. The slime tutorial has progeria in the title. Half the reviews bring it up, so there was a world where they could have acknowledged that and at the very least shouted out the PRF to get them an influx of donations for research and for support of the people the show's indirectly profiting off of, but that choice was simply not made. I will link the PRF website in the description if you want to send them a donation, by the way. I forgot to mention that earlier. My biggest through line question to the show though is how would this affect Kimberly's day-to-day life? Because that feels like a giant dramaturgical hole. Seth mentions all these different symptoms that manifest over time. We know that her cardiac issues would have appeared by puberty. She's 16, she's well past puberty. And she's at the end of her life expectancy, so she should be experiencing most, if not all of these symptoms by now. But then in the show itself, the only symptom beyond looking old that we ever see is her having a single heart attack, which Brief sidebar, her deciding to break out of the hospital because maybe it's time to throw caution to the wind, at least we'll be living, is a wild narrative choice. Very age appropriate, but a wild narrative choice. But I feel like there was such a strong emphasis on her looking different rather than being different, which is only a small portion of what her life would actually look like. We should see her joint pain impacting things. We should see physical therapy conflicting with her wanting to hang out with her friends. She should get annoyed at having to wear a clunky heart monitor or needing to stay home because she's exhausted and need to get notes as to what's happening in class from her friends. She should have to worry about taking lots of pills and keeping track of what she's eating to not interfere with them. She should get annoyed that the school nurse keeps coming into class to check on her all the time. There were lots of things that could have created really interesting conflicts in this story that weren't there. I think in particular, Seth coming over to her house to give her the biology notes he meticulously took and color-coded in class that day for her would have been an adorable scene that we just missed out on. I feel that perhaps narratively the reason they didn't have her aging seem to appear at all until the heart attack is to make it feel more like you're waiting for the other shoe to drop the entire show, but I actually think showing the dichotomy of sick to well that she's constantly balancing would build that suspense better beyond just fleshing out her character a good deal further. The show also contains a lot of narrative around her parents having a hard time taking care of her and seeing her as a burden in a way that made me quite uncomfortable. It's made a little bit clear that they believe this not because she's disabled, but because she was an accidental teen pregnancy, but it still was not my favorite. And I think if the day-to-day aspects were put into that show, that might make that more of an issue, but there is a world where part of the parents being abusive to her is them trying to pretend her disease doesn't exist and regularly like forgetting to pick up her meds or acknowledge that she might be in pain or try to gaslight her out of her symptoms or otherwise just like visibly drop the ball regularly in that regard and then complain about how much she ruined their lives when they're clearly doing absolutely nothing to try to take care of her. And then it's even clear that it's not the disability that is the issue, it's her existence to begin with. I'm not too mad about her disease never being named. I think they ran the risk of having it sound too fantastical or being too close to something that already exists, so I'm kind of indifferent in either direction there. But I did see some comments saying that the very least they could do was give her the dignity of having a named disease, which I don't entirely disagree with either. But at the same time, if the prevalence is 1 in 50 million newborns, she may be one of like 4 or less people with her disease currently living at any given time. So there is also a world where it's just so unique to her, or it doesn't have a specific name because it's so rare, or they don't even bother to actually figure out what the precise diagnosis is because they have no idea. But either way, I do wish that that were fleshed out a bit more. Now on the positive side, I think it touched on some aspects of disabled life quite nicely, particularly the grief around birthdays, the quiet struggling with things that you don't want to talk to anybody about and people pretend they don't see because it makes them uncomfortable. People's general uncomfortability around things that to you are just facts of life. I think the aspects of grief and acceptance that they tried to touch on could have been a lot stronger. I generally felt like that lacked a lot of substance, which I think was deliberate to keep the show light and fluffy, but I think that depth would have actually aided in grounding that tone a good deal. The biology class scene where she felt like a freak on display in particular resonated with me a lot as somebody with a psych degree who like never knew whether it was a good idea to disclose my lived experience or not in the classroom. But at the same time, that scene didn't make me uncomfortable in the way that it was supposed to make me uncomfortable, because my actual uncomfortability was in what the people around me were laughing at, not in what the scene actually was saying, because the scene to me just felt real. It was not funny, but other people were laughing as if it was funny, and that just, I didn't love that. One comment I read on some forum somewhere said, "There are times I don't enjoy a show or think it's as great as everyone says because it touches on some real life experience and appears to write it in a way that suggests the writer is guessing what that is like or using it as imagined conflict / plot point, etc." And I feel that this vibe consistently appeared throughout the show. If I remember correctly, that comment was in reference to the way closeted high school queerness is handled in the show, but I feel that it also very much applies to Kimberly and how so many things were touched on a little bit in a sort of like, oh, we've heard about this way, or we think this might exist way, but never dove deeper into them because there was no lived experience, nuance, or depth behind that, which made even the pieces that felt authentic and real to me feel more like disabled people are being viewed through a magnifying glass like a curious bug than anything else. There's also disability in the other characters I wanted to note. First, there's Buddy and his alcohol problem. Alcoholism and otherwise addiction is not my particular academic expertise, so I can't speak precisely on the quality of that representation here, but I felt like it was handled pretty well. They didn't entirely demonize him for having an addiction. It just was a thing that existed and greatly impacted his relationships with his family. Patty's hypochondria, on the other hand, I think was handled quite oddly overall. It felt somewhat unclear how much she was constantly genuinely getting hurt versus how much she was exaggerating things versus how much she was making things up entirely, that I kind of wish had been clarified, particularly because in leaving it ambiguous, it can easily lean into a sort of, this overdramatic mentally ill woman is faking symptoms for attention in a way that can perpetuate questioning of symptoms in people, particularly women, which is a huge and pervasive issue. And that may seem like a little bit of like a leap in consequences from this show itself, but for me, I was watching it and trying to give her the benefit of the doubt because the information that we got was so unclear, while other people seemed to automatically be laughing at, and it seemed the narrative wanted you to believe these supposed fake ailments, when it was never actually entirely clear how fake or not fake they were. And I'm always going to take issue with any story that relies on a woman faking diseases or over-exaggerating diseases, particularly if it is for comedic purpose, just based on how real the disbelief of women still is in medical settings and how often that does actively kill people. I don't really think that's something we should be making light of unless it's done with a great deal of care and attention that I don't think was really taken here. Also, most of this, I'm not really saying to like critique the writers, but more to be like, hey, dramaturgs are great and you should hire them because we point these things out and that is our job in a rehearsal space. I will also mention that Seth is deeply autistic coded to a degree where I almost want to just say that it's canon, particularly since the song Anagram talks a lot about how he sees the world a little differently, how he's a beat behind, and he continuously misses social cues throughout the entire show. We also know that he's on anxiety medication, we know he gets the occasional panic attack, and he also stims a lot when he's nervous. And after seeing the play, which we're going to talk about in a moment, his original characterization was as the foil or the straight man in that version, where he had to be deadpan and the only like normal person present and maintain some level of composure. And the straight man archetype often ends up coming across as autistic coded regardless of how the character is written because of what purpose they serve comedically and thus how that needs to be delivered. I just think that this got really expanded upon when it transferred over to be a musical. And to be clear, I think he's super well written as a non-explicit autistic character, and he's able to get away with saying a lot of the harsher comedic things because he's not socially aware. I just think it's interesting how an archetype becomes a character and what that presents to an audience. I will say the way that this characterization is written, I do feel that if Seth were not played with complete authenticity and groundedness, it could easily come across as a bit of a caricature or otherwise using autistic people for the purpose of comedy, kind of in the way that like the dad from the Back to the Future musical is typically presented. But Justin Cooley did a fantastic job and handled those nuances perfectly, so that's more I don't know what the other Seths are doing, and I just want to point that out script-wise, but at least that particular performance was fantastic. My one other note on Seth would be that it sort of implies that he's the one who loves and is into her because he sees the world differently, not because she's conventionally lovable or attractive. I saw some folks commenting on how that struck them a little weirdly, a sort of like, you should only date within your own kind angle to it. I think that can be kind of up for interpretation in any direction. It doesn't totally bother me here, but I just did want to name that regardless. What I find most interesting about Kimberly Akimbo is that while statistically more recent disability representation is better than older disability representation, the original play actually handles a lot of these things a lot more effectively than the musical does. For a brief historical detour, the late 90s and early 2000s is the time frame when a lot of media would just like throw disability into what would have already been an interesting story as a sort of side note to further complicate a plot rather than the direct purpose of a piece itself in a way that actually tends to age better than we would expect it to. Other things from this era include, of course, The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, also I Am Sam, Newsies, Benny and June, Warriors of Virtue, Finding Nemo, My Sister's Keeper. There are also some things with serious issues from this time, but I generally find as a reviewer that rep between like 1992 and 2008 tends to be stronger than anything I pull from the 2010s, where I feel like most everything in the 2010s is just straight inspiration corn. And maybe all of that is just a bias of me going into older things expecting them to be worse because of the year they were made, and I have higher expectations for more recent work. But normally I go into reviewing things with no idea when something was made, and I like to guess based on the quality and style of representation. The other day, oh my gosh, side note, the other day I got a Grey's Anatomy autism episode guest within about 6 weeks of when it was filmed, and it was just very odd, and I might know too many things in a particular direction. But focusing on the topic at hand, Kimberly Akimbo is not the first time that Lindsay Abaire played with disability in a play of his. One of his most famous plays that ran at MTC in 1999 is called Fighting Mirrors, which is about an amnesiac who wakes up each morning with a blank slate memory, kind of like 50 First Dates. And also there's a guy solely known as Limping Man, and then her mother has a type of aphasia after a stroke. I don't know enough about that play to further comment on it, and I did not have time to track it down or read it before I made this video, but I just wanted to point out that this is not the first time that disability has appeared in one of his plays. Now, in reading the Kimberly Akimbo play, I was struck by how much of the dialogue and plot points are identical to the musical, and yet how much the vibes and tone are completely different. They both went for a sort of dark comedy with some darker and more sentimental pieces that tries to ground itself in realism with huge suspension of disbelief moments, but where the musical feels a bit unfocused and tonally inconsistent, the play feels more like a through and through black comedy where everything is just chaos from start to finish. And I think the primary aspect of why this works better in the play is that it's a play. The songs in the show really bring out the sentimental moments to a degree that is very effective emotionally, but sort of messes up the tonal rhythm of the black comedy aspects. It also slows down the momentum of building chaos that really moves in the play. The addition of the show choir quartet for the musical, who are all archetypes as much as every other character is in that show, feels a bit like it messes with the suspension of disbelief because they feel just real enough, but just not real enough as to feel like they're not fleshed out versus being archetypes, which then reflects oddly on other characters that isn't an issue in the play because they don't exist. Seth in the play is named Jeff, and he sort of functions as the straight man for all of the comedy to play off of because he's the only normal adjacent person to exist in the show, which I feel heightened the chaos energy a bit. They also better handle the mother's hypochondria and making it a bit clearer that she's over-exaggerating things for attention. It's still not entirely clear how much is real versus exaggerated versus made up entirely, but during the final fight she says that she wanted another baby and wanted to make sure it wouldn't be like Kimberly because soon Kim will die and then she'll be alone, and then she pauses and backtracks and she goes, I mean, I'll die. I was making a sister for you so that you would have somebody to talk to when I died, not you. So it becomes a lot clearer that this is a weird coping mechanism of sorts rather than just like an odd quirk that she has, which I think could have been fleshed out further in the musical. She also has a preoccupation with death as a concept in a way that isn't in the musical that I really liked. And they had her talk in one of the monologues about how as soon as Kimberly was born, she was whisked away to the ICU, so she never got the chance to like have skin to skin or breastfeed or really fully bond with her daughter at the beginning, and she thinks that impacted their ability to have a mother-child bond in the way that she'd imagined. And that probably would not happen with a baby born with progeria since they wouldn't know immediately, but maybe something else happened with Kimberly as well, I don't know. The play also has more through line in regards to her being disabled. We see her complain about aches and pains during Act 1, and they plan to take her to the clinic about it, and after the heart attack she's being forced to eat more boring and healthy food that she doesn't want. We know that she does exercises and she takes pills, so it feels a bit more grounded and a bit less out of the blue, though it definitely still could have been integrated in a great deal more. The metaphor of time passing and being grateful for what you have is still as incredibly strong as it is in the musical, but because the play doesn't really sit in any sentimental moment longer than a page or two, it doesn't feel like it's deliberately meant to inspire you or make you feel some kind of way. It's just meant to make you think, so that felt a bit more balanced. Now, after reading the play, I went to the Theater on Film and Tape archive at the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts, semi-regular reminder to go support your local libraries, to watch the 2003 off-Broadway production as directed by David Petrarca, and I still preferred it to the musical, but it became clear that a lot of the comedy that I was reading is potentially working in the script could be delivered in many different ways, and the way that they delivered in 2003 was very 2003. Aunt Deborah in particular, played by Anna Gasteyer, wore a do-rag for much of the show and was a sort of caricatured lesbian type, which was not my favorite, and also felt like a bit of a waste of Gasteyer's talent in particular, but I'm acknowledging the time period. Also, Jeff was played by a very young John Gallagher Jr., and he crushed it. The music was by Jason Robert Brown. He also crushed it. And from a design perspective, I felt a bit like the stage was swallowing them whole because it was ginormous, but looking at it from a different angle, it also made them look a bit like paper dolls in a toy house, which set a very specific vibe that accentuated the absurdity of the piece. This also may have just been the camera angle in which it was filmed. I don't know what it felt like in person. I haven't been in that theater before to know that. Also, all the scene transitions had projections of a ticking clock, which I felt walked the line between super interesting and creative and very on the nose. I don't really have opinions in either direction on that. Now, in this version, Kimberly was played by Mary Louise Burke, who was in Fighting Years a few years earlier, and she's shorter than everybody else in the cast, so she felt more like a kid who looked old than Victoria Clark, who was taller than most of the cast in the musical. I'm genuinely not sure if Burke did more childish physicality than Clark did, or if it was just the height differential that made it look different, but I thought that made it narratively a lot stronger. This version of Kimberly also sort of read a bit more like an older person with a developmental and or intellectual disability in some moments in a way that never really came across in the musical. I don't really have commentary on that. I just thought it was interesting to note. They also gave her a cane when she was the old woman for check fraud in the second act, which she seemed to genuinely use to prop herself up, which is very interesting to see. I would be super interested to see this play staged today with some line changes for particular jokes that did not age well, and just see how that translates with a more modern lens at what comedy looks like. I think that'd be quite interesting. The other version of the story that I should also mention is the 1996 Robin Williams film Jack. I found this film via a lot of comments comparing the two stories. I've never seen any of the creatives say anything in regards to it being any inspiration for Akimbo or even as existing. So there is definitely a universe where Lindsay Abaire watched it and forgot about it, so it never came up because the plot is very similar and the structure is very similar. And so I wanted to include it in here to talk about another version of a similar narrative. Also, just because I watched it, I want to tell you about it. This is my favorite version of the story actually, and it's on Disney Plus, I want to say, so you should go watch it. In this movie, Robin Williams plays a boy who ages 4 times faster than the average person. His teacher is played by J-Lo and his tutor is played by Bill Cosby. wild casting. Jack's mother gives birth to him as a full-sized child at 2 months gestation, and that in and of itself makes it automatically feel super fantastical. But they also ground it very hard in medical language. They talk about progeria being another advanced aging condition that is more debilitating in comparison to what Jack has, where he seems to be perfectly healthy, just fast, but also his heart has a hard time keeping up with the speed of growth. They also never tell him what his life expectancy is because they don't know. He's the one who figures it out himself and doesn't know what to do with that information because he's 10, or how to cope with it, which felt like a nice narrative beat to have in there. They did some camera work to sort of show his point of view sometimes that I felt was very interesting and helped center him narratively a bit more. And also his parents were loving and lovely, which gave him and his struggles more space to breathe in comparison to Akimbo, where there's just so much going on at once. I also really like how they handled the kid logic of it, where they called him a freak and weird until they realized that he could help them win a basketball game against the bullies. And from there they realized that he's actually pretty cool and decided to keep him around to become actual real friends. And they also really gave Jack space to be a regular 10-year-old, being nervous about friends on the playground and about grades and about going out to play with the kids on his street and using the fact that he looks old to buy dirty magazines for them to look at. Yes, he's processing stuff that the other kids didn't have to, but also he got a lot of time to just be 10 without a narrative emphasis on, oh, he's wiser beyond his years. It's just nope, he's 10, that's weird. And I like that a lot better. The inspiration corn aspects of the narrative still stayed, and that we see one of the kids give a speech in class for the what do I want to be when I grow up project, that he wants to be just like Jack. They also have Jack give a speech at high school graduation where he talks about how everybody there is worried about their future, but look at him, he doesn't have one, so remember, life is precious and fleeting and enjoy it. But since we knew all these characters and storylines by then, it felt kind of earned in a way that I don't think the final number of Akimbo ever really truly does. They also played with very weird relationship dynamics, in that Jack goes to a bar to meet the mom of one of his friends, who's played by Fran Drescher, and they end up kissing in the car on the way home, which was odd. This was a moment that also felt more like an intellectual disability situation than it did anything else. But overall, I think having him be 10 gave a lot more interesting things to play with narratively than we have with a 16-year-old. And I think it balanced the fantastical elements with the grounded elements in a really strong way that made this film really work. It's weird, don't get me wrong, but I think I'd watch it again. Maybe. Anyway, back to the original musical we're talking about. We found ourselves at the now what section of this video. Now in regards to staging it ethically as it currently exists, obviously the primary thing is hey, what if we use this as an opportunity to deliberately cast disabled performers, since it's a story that is currently about us without us? There's also a huge chance here to shout at the Progeria Research Foundation, which I think would be wonderful. In regards to what I would say were I in a production room while this show was being written, the first thing that I would point out is the inconsistency and lack of clarity around the mother's hypochondria that I think could have been tightened up a bit more. There also could have been more clarity and grounding in what Kimberly's disability actually is, potentially in a way that nods to progeria as being a real thing that exists. Because in general, there's very little exposition as to what Kimberly's daily life looks like as a disabled person, or what her symptoms actually are. She doesn't really show any symptoms or things affecting her life beyond her appearance being different until the moment that she has a heart attack. And even then, no repercussions in regards to that happen after that I think would have been interesting to explore, beyond the fact that it would just flesh her out a bit more. The dynamic of a child who is completely parentified in addition to having to manage their own physical and mental needs in a disability sense is a very interesting one that I feel was a bit of a missed opportunity here. I think in general, expanding her character out and centering her more thoroughly would help a bit with the inspiration corn aspects of this piece. But even then, the primary messaging of the show is about realizing the beauty of life and how fleeting it is, using disability as the metaphor to point to that. And there's not a whole lot that we can do to uninspiration corn that. But that's all I have for this show. I hope that this was interesting. I hope that you learned something. Let me know what you thought of the show, if you've seen it or if you're going to go see it on tour. I would love to know all the things. Also, if you've seen it on Broadway and you're seeing it on tour, let me know if there's any differences, because I am curious. I was going to try to see if I could find it in Boston or in Providence or Philadelphia to research for this video, and then I didn't check the schedule in advance to actually know where it was going to be, so I didn't plan very well. But yeah, as always, thank you for being here. Thank you for being. Remember, critical thinking is really sexy, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.